Rain fell in thin silver lines over the Kentucky hills that morning of 1945. On the open field behind Camp Atterbury, the earth was dark with mud and memory. Dozens of German prisoners of war sat upright on horses, their bodies still awkward from paralysis, their uniforms faded to gray. The animals stood calm beneath the drizzle, tails flicking, breath steaming in the cold. A U.S. Army cameraman adjusted his reel and whispered to a medic beside him, "They look like ghosts learning to live again." That sentence would later become a caption in Army medical training film number 120, Physical Rehabilitation, screened at Valley Forge Hospital before thousands of young therapists who could not believe what they were seeing. These were not actors. They were the broken remnants of the Third Reich's army. Men who had crossed oceans in captivity, whose nerves had been cut by shrapnel, whose faith in power had been severed by surrender. Now they were being taught to move again, not by machines, but by horses. Each hoofbeat echoed like a pulse reborn. The rain carried no music, only rhythm, steady, patient, ancient. Some of the prisoners turned their heads slightly toward the cameraman, not in defiance, but in quiet bewilderment. Why would their enemy put them on horses instead of leaving them in wheelchairs? Why this gentleness after so much cruelty? One American doctor later said the silence that day was louder than any victory parade. The only movement came from the horses' flanks rising and falling, the faint hiss of rain on leather saddles, and the trembling hands of men who had forgotten how to trust their own bodies. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Because in this field, in this rain, time itself seemed to hesitate, as if the world needed to watch these broken soldiers take their first steps back into being human. Doctors at Valley Forge Hospital began noticing something science couldn't easily explain. The paralyzed men who sat on horses, even those with almost no voluntary leg movement, began to sway gently, then steadily, in rhythm with the animal beneath them. Their hips shifted, their spines loosened, their bodies unconsciously remembered balance. It wasn't command or training, it was reflex. A 1946 article in Army Medical Journal called it a neurological mirroring reflex. Schwab-Kish. The phrase sounded clinical, but what the doctors saw looked like something older, deeper, a dialogue between two living beings, one carrying the memory of movement for the other. Dr. Margaret Eaton, a physiotherapist assigned to the camp, kept a leather-bound notebook filled with patient sketches. She wrote, "When the body forgets how to walk, the horse remembers for it." The line passed from one ward to another like a quiet prayer. Soon it was painted above the stable door where the sessions took place. Soldiers and prisoners alike began to call it the House of Memory. Colonel Harold Birch, who oversaw the rehabilitation program, was a cavalryman before the war. He noticed that when the horses trotted at a controlled pace, the pelvis of the rider moved in the same three-dimensional pattern as human walking, forward, sideways, and rotationally. The perfect imitation of steps. That natural motion reawakened dormant nerve pathways better than any mechanical exercise device of the time. "The horses," he said in one briefing, "are our most disciplined therapists." The prisoners started competing to care for them. One group brushed their manes at dawn, another cleaned hooves after sessions, another sang low German folk songs to calm nervous animals before new patients mounted. They called a brown mare Elsa after the word for oath because, as one man explained, she never breaks the promise of balance. Everyday life inside the camp subtly shifted. Where there had been resignation, there was now a schedule of feeding, grooming, and gradual motion. Doctors watched men who once stared at the ceiling now look forward, anticipating the next ride. Eaton noticed small miracles, a finger twitching after weeks of stillness, a spine straightening when a horse inhaled. To outsiders, it seemed absurd. Defeated enemies learning to move again through American horses. But inside that stable, nobody thought of nations. They thought of rhythm, of warmth, of memory. And for the first time since the front collapsed, the word therapy began to mean something closer to grace. His name was Rudolf Eberhardt, born in Bremen, former cavalry sergeant of the 3rd Panzer Division. He had grown up riding draft horses through wheat fields before Hitler's rise. In 1941, his unit crossed into the Soviet Union. By 1944, he was captured outside Cherbourg, his legs shattered by mortar fire. After surgery and amputation, the lower half of his body no longer obeyed him. He was 27 when he arrived at Valley Forge, convinced that his life had already ended. When the order came for him to try equine therapy, he thought it was mockery. He asked through a translator, "Why would you put a cripple on a horse?" But they lifted him anyway, 2 orderlies and Dr. Margaret Eaton herself, onto a calm gray mare named Daisy. The horse shifted slightly, sensing the imbalance of the man on her back. Eberhardt's fingers trembled on the reins. For the first time in a year, his body moved without pain, not walking, but swaying with another heartbeat. The motion unlocked something buried deeper than injury. He bent forward, pressed his forehead against the animal's neck, and began to cry. "Es riecht wie zu Hause," he whispered. "It smells like home." The scent of rain-soaked hay, the warmth of breathing hide, the rhythm under him. It all returned at once. The fields of his childhood, the horses his father once cared for, the innocence that had vanished before he could notice. Dr. Eaton's medical note from Rehabilitation Case Study number 47 records it plainly. Patient cried uncontrollably upon first ride, expressed gratitude to the animal. No mention of the translator quietly wiping his own eyes nearby or the silence that filled the barn after. The other prisoners, waiting their turn, didn't speak. They just watched, realizing that what was happening before them wasn't humiliation. It was resurrection. From that day on, Rudolf Eberhardt became the unofficial assistant to the therapy unit. He learned the horse's moods, memorized feeding times, taught new arrivals how to breathe with the animal's stride. "She walks for me," he once told an American sergeant, "and maybe someday I will walk for her." It was a sentence no propaganda could have produced, no manual could have predicted. Just a man and a horse, reclaiming together the simplest motion on earth. The rhythm of life continuing despite everything that tried to end it. By autumn 1945, the wooden stables behind Camp Atterbury no longer smelled of war, but of hay, soap, and candle wax. The prisoners had begun to gather there even after their therapy sessions ended. They cleaned the floors, fixed loose boards, and arranged crude benches from packing crates. On Sundays, they lit lanterns between the stalls, their light flickering across horses half asleep. Someone brought an old harmonium from the infirmary storage. When its keys were pressed, the music mixed with the slow breathing of the animals, like hymns carried on wind. They prayed, not for Germany, not for release, but for forgiveness and meaning. One of them, a former artillery officer named Hans Weigel, said in broken English, "We do not pray to win anymore. We pray to be allowed to live rightly again." His words were written down by Red Cross observers in Camp Atterbury Report, 1945. In the same report, American guards are noted as attending those services, sitting beside their prisoners in silence. It was then that someone remarked on the strangeness. The horse's stable had turned into a chapel. And wasn't that fitting? The place where Christ was said to have been born, a manger. now echoed with men seeking rebirth. Under rafters blackened by age, former soldiers whispered psalms and apologies to a god they thought had long abandoned Europe. A chaplain named Lieutenant Samuel Graves later wrote to his wife, "They sing off key but with hearts in tune. It is as if they are rebuilding something the bombs could not touch." His letter, preserved in the Valley Forge archives, remains one of the few testimonies of shared worship between enemies during wartime captivity. Everyday details made the transformation even more human. Horses shifted hooves as the choir sang. An American medic placed a small wooden cross between feed buckets. A German carpenter carved the word Gnade, mercy, into the doorpost. Even the guards began greeting each other in the mornings with "peace of the day," a phrase borrowed from the prisoners' prayers. The war had divided the world into victors and defeated. But in those quiet evenings, when moonlight passed through the cracks of the stable roof, there was no triumph, no ideology, only the rhythm of breath, the scent of hay, and the sound of men remembering that faith could survive captivity. When Stars and Stripes photojournalist Paul Blandford arrived at Camp Atterbury in December 1945, he expected a routine assignment. The war was over, and the American public wanted reassurance. Stories about victory, rehabilitation, progress. What he found inside the therapy stables shook him instead. He saw German prisoners with braces on their legs, laughing while brushing horses. He saw an American corporal steadying a paralyzed man in the saddle as though he were a brother, not an enemy. The air smelled of liniment and hay, of new beginnings that refused to fit the familiar narrative of punishment. Blandford raised his camera, but his hands trembled. "I came to see crippled enemies," he later wrote in his journal. "I left seeing men who stood taller than any victor." Those photographs appeared in the Christmas issue of Stars and Stripes on December 24th, 1945. Black and white images, but alive with warmth. A German POW smiling shyly from horseback, a nurse tying a man's boot, sunlight streaming through barn slats like stained glass. Within days, major newspapers reprinted them. Life magazine ran a feature titled "The Gentle War After the War." Letters flooded military offices across the country. Some readers praised the compassion, others were angry. One veteran from Omaha wrote, "My brother died in France. Why are we teaching the Huns to ride again?" But even the anger meant something had shifted. For the first time, the American public saw German faces not as caricatures of evil, but as men. Doctors at Valley Forge received requests from hospitals and universities to replicate the program. The Army's Rehabilitation Division recorded a 78% improvement in physical and emotional recovery among those exposed to animal therapy, a number no one expected. When asked years later why he kept photographing that day, Blandford said, "Because mercy was standing right in front of me, and I was afraid it might disappear." His negatives remain preserved in the National Archives, frame after frame of rain-damp uniforms, fragile smiles, and eyes that seem to understand both defeat and redemption. Looking at them today, you can almost hear the horses shifting, the soft rustle of straw, the click of a shutter catching a brief moment when history forgot which side it was on. What do you see when you look at those photos? Do you see forgiveness? Or do you see a world struggling to believe in it? Few official reports ever mention it, but the American guards stationed at Valley Forge carried their own invisible wounds. Some had survived Anzio or Normandy. Some had buried friends in France, and now they were asked to watch over men who had once tried to kill them. They followed orders, smiled through briefings, but nights were restless. They woke from dreams of explosions, sweat cold under regulation blankets. The word hadn't yet existed, PTSD, but the symptoms were there, thick as fog. Dr. Eaton began to notice the guards lingering after sessions, feeding horses, helping the paralyzed prisoners dismount. One sergeant named Bill Rawlins confessed that he hadn't been able to sleep since 1944. Too many faces, he said. She suggested he join the therapy group, brushing the horses alongside the POWs. At first he laughed, then he tried it. Within a week, he stayed longer than his shift. I stopped dreaming of corpses when I started brushing the horses with them, he wrote later in a note found in his locker after discharge. The U.S. Army Neuropsychiatric Evaluation Reports, 1946, quietly confirmed what everyone sensed. Contact with the animals and with the prisoners eased the guards' anxiety. They called it dual healing. The line between caretaker and patient blurred until it dissolved. One American medic said, "We came to fix their bodies. They ended up fixing our minds." The horses, it seemed, didn't care who had worn which uniform. They responded only to calm hands and steady voices. A paralyzed German named Meyer taught Rawlins how to read a horse's breathing. 3 slow exhales meant trust, 2 sharp ones meant fear. Soon, the pair began working in silence, communicating through motion alone. One afternoon, an observer recorded a scene that would never appear in official films. 2 men, one in khaki, one in a POW jacket, standing side by side, each holding a curry brush, cleaning the same mare. No words, just rhythm. For that brief hour, the war had no place to stand. It's hard not to wonder, what if every prison, every battlefield, every memory of conflict had such a neutral witness as a horse? Would the world have healed faster if mercy had a mane and 4 legs instead of a flag? Tell me what you think. Could an act so small, a shared brushstroke, a gentle rhythm, really mend 2 broken nations? By the summer of 1946, the war had truly ended, even in the quiet corners of Kentucky and Pennsylvania. Repatriation orders came, typed in blue ink and stamped with the seal of the War Department. The paralyzed men, those who had learned to move again through patience, and those who never fully regained it, were gathered for farewell. Outside the stables, rows of horses stood saddled one final time. The program that had begun as an experiment in compassion had turned into something sacred. Colonel Harold Birch addressed them briefly. He didn't speak of victory or defeat, only of endurance. "These animals," he said, "gave us back something we thought war had taken forever." Then he nodded to Dr. Eaton, who climbed the small fence and led the first horse out. The men mounted slowly, awkwardly, some with braces strapped to their knees, some lifted by orderlies who had become friends. Cameras clicked. A local boy waved a flag too large for his hands. They rode in circles across the field under a bright afternoon sun. Slow, careful, deliberate. Dust rose like gold smoke around them. For the onlookers, it was impossible to tell which were the prisoners and which were the guards. All uniforms looked the same when covered with dust. At the far end of the field, a truck engine coughed to life. The convoy that would take them to ships bound for Europe. But none of the riders looked back. The horses moved in unison, each step echoing the rhythm they had learned together. When they dismounted, a few men left their crutches and canes leaning against the fence. No one asked why. Perhaps it was an offering. Months later, a letter arrived in Germany, published in the Neue Zeitung in 1948. It came from one of those prisoners, now walking again. "The last thing I saw in America was the dust from their hooves. It looked like freedom itself." That line spread quietly through displaced persons camps and hospitals, still full of broken veterans. To many, it sounded like redemption written in motion. That evening, after the riders had gone, the horses were transported to a Pennsylvania farm. Soldiers removed their bridles and let them run into the open pasture. They galloped hard into the horizon, their shapes shrinking into the light. Reminders that not every gift of war was born from destruction. They came as broken men, Dr. Eaton would later write in her unpublished memoir. They left riding something America never captured, humanity. The camera faded to the field, empty but alive with memory. The dust settled slowly, like prayer. When the war ended, nations rebuilt with steel and politics, but some of its quietest repairs happened in places without banners, in the stables of Valley Forge, where mercy replaced victory. What began as a medical experiment turned into a testament that movement could heal not only muscles, but memory. Those paralyzed German prisoners, once instruments of destruction, rediscovered the rhythm of life through creatures that knew nothing of ideology. In every hoofbeat, they heard a truth older than borders, that healing is not given by conquest, but by care. Years later, Dr. Margaret Eaton would describe a dream that returned to her often. The sound of rain on tin roofs, the slow breathing of horses, and the laughter of men who once had no reason to laugh. She said she never remembered their faces clearly, only the way they sat upright, as if each breath they took carried the weight of a second chance. Colonel Birch, writing to an old comrade, confessed that it had been the only part of his military career where silence felt victorious. He wrote, "No anthem could reach what those hooves said." The legacy of that program rippled quietly across decades. By 1952, equine therapy had become a recognized rehabilitation practice in several Allied hospitals. Later, civilian centers adopted it for wounded children and veterans alike. Few of those who benefited ever knew that its beginnings lay in an unlikely scene, former enemies sharing gentleness under American rain. If you watch those archival reels today, the rain, the trembling hands, the horses moving patiently, you can almost feel the air thick with something human that refused to die. It reminds us that compassion does not erase the past, but it gives it a different ending. And perhaps that is the truest kind of victory. Not the flag raised over ruins, but the moment when a broken man lifted onto a horse learns to trust the world again.